Impact Audio presents Land Rich, Cash Poor by Brian Reisinger. Read for you by the author. To my dad, as good and true a farmer as there's ever been. Introduction. Springwater. They came from miles around, a few as far as Illinois, to see the old farmhouse before it was gone. The farm that sprang forth from it had been in existence for well over 100 years. It was the driftless region of southern Wisconsin, called such because the glaciers stopped short of this place thousands of years ago, leaving its soaring hills and plunging valleys intact. Sitting in one such valley, at the end of a steep, bending road where the township pavement ended and gave way to dirt, the old homestead and surrounding buildings were cordoned off, like a secret, holy place, from the rest of the world. The house was small, but tall in their minds with the memories it bore, of origins and hardships and shots at the middle class. Their numbers had multiplied when they heard Helene was coming. She was nearly 90 years old then and the last of the generation who could tell stories of growing up in that house during the Great Depression. Her only remaining sister was not able to travel, and the rest of the original 14 brothers and sisters were dead. The summer sun bathed the farmyard and the valley of rolling green hills beyond as Helene stepped out of her daughter's car to look upon the place where she'd been born. A quiet fell. It was her first time seeing the home farm in 68 years. Helene smiled and nodded and began to talk, picking her steps and her stories with care, remembering those olden days. Helene's father and mother, Alice and Teresa, had started it all on that little farm. She told of survival, of Teresa giving birth to 13 children in that house until she bled so badly during her final labor that they feared for her life and went to the hospital. She told of hard work, as a young woman carrying 80-pound pails of milk from the barn to the tank in the milk house. She told of a natural spring the family harnessed to draw water out of the surrounding hills. These were the stories they knew that made their lives possible. Without this place, there was nothing else. But times had changed. The natural spring was buried back in the woods behind the house and offered no more water to the slumping buildings. The angular old farmhouse was crooked now, warped with age, and nobody lived in it anymore. It smelled of mold and wild animals. The squat wooden milk house was weathered gray. All of it, the farmyard and memories, sat in what had been the orbit of the old barn, before it became so brittle that one day it simply collapsed. Although the surrounding land was still part of a working farm, one now operated from another farmhouse up the hill, the faded farmyard here on the original homestead seemed to preserve in place what was happening to so many other farms, a steady but somehow sudden disappearance. At one time, nearly every family Helene had grown up knowing in that area was a farm family, and most of her 14 siblings either farmed for a living at one time or worked on someone else's farm. Now nearly all of the extended family had jobs off the farm, save for her nephew Jim, who owned the property. He was still farming crops and raising heifers for other dairy herds and steers for meat, up the hill on the nearby farm. Jim's grandfather and father, Helene's father and eldest brother, bought the land to expand upon the original homestead, back in the days when family farming was the future and not the past. But now even Jim had to sell his herd of milk cows and alter his business model to keep the farm going, hoping as they all gathered that day that he'd done the right thing. There was only one other working farm left between Jim's and the highway. The story of the disappearing American farmer is at once a sweeping economic history of the most urgent, unexplained socioeconomic crisis in our country today, and a brutally personal hardship for the families living it. Small family farms like the one Helene grew up on once not only dominated the landscape of places like the rural Midwest, but also defined much of the economy and culture in the United States. In 1920, following the rise in American farming before years of economic depression hit, there were nearly 6.5 million farms in the United States. That came out to about 16 people for every farm in the country, the exact size of Helene's family. The number of farms had been on the upswing for decades, with families getting started in the Midwest and other agricultural enclaves across the country. In places like Wisconsin, America's dairyland, such family farming took root just in time to face the devastation of the Depression. The farms that survived the Depression emerged to power the rural economy with enough dynamism to deliver, within just one generation, middle-class status for countless families that began by digging their living out of the dirt. Along the way, America's identity became intertwined with the family farm, a connection that began with the ideal of the yeoman farmer Thomas Jefferson wrote about as the foundation of a young nation, and stands to this day with a wide range of public opinion polling consistently showing trust in farm families at well over 70%. And yet, just 2 generations after the Depression, American family farming had taken a hard fall. By 2020, 1 century after Helene's family typified the American experience, there were just 2 million farms in the United States, a nearly 70% drop. That meant there were approximately 162 people in the United States for every farm, compared to the 16 people per farm from 100 years earlier. Economic devastation in changing times, the Great Depression to the farm crisis of the 1980s to the recessions and other crises of the 21st century, all took their toll.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?